Democrats these days seem more interested in defending crime than stopping it. The soft on crime policies of the left have shown themselves time and again to be detrimental to the very people they claim to protect. Crime tends to impact lower income communities, which are disproportionately black and Hispanic, worse. So while white liberals get to tell black people in the hood that the police are really the problem, I notice none of those same liberals want to live there. Yet, rather than admit that their idiotic policies like defund the police, no cash bail, and the decriminalization of everything under the sun were bad, Democrats insist that the Republicans are the real problem. For example, how dare President Trump try to imply that D.C. is a criminally infested hellscape where the murder rate is higher than Bogota? I mean, yes, that may be true, but how dare he notice? When Republicans point out the failures of Democratic policies, it makes the Democrats feel bad. And isn't that the real crime? I'm Tyler Chrestman. Welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I have two topics we're going to be talking about this week. We are going to talk about the executive takeover of Washington, D.C. and all the anarchy that has followed. And we're going to be talking about this thing in New York. There was there was some reporting around the safe injection sites that have opened up in New York. For those of you who don't know, those are the place where they give out clean needles with people, blah, blah, blah. We're going to talk about this, whether or not it's good, bad, and what's actually happened. We're going to get into all that. But first, before we do, my favorite comment from last week comes from Nelson Dashner 7758, who said, Senator Hawley's proposed stock trade ban is pure political theater. While Hawley does not invest in individual stocks, he and his wife do invest in mutual funds and the like. Hawley knows that the bill he is proposing will never pass, so there's no real risk. It's all for show, end quote. Okay, yeah, maybe. I'm not convinced. I think that, so by the way, the bill that was exactly what it would do for the rest of Congress. It would make it so that you can't trade in individual stocks. It would make it so that you can only invest in mutual funds and the like, which is fine. I think that that's fine. Congress should be able to have retirement accounts. I don't think we want to take those away from Congress people. The problem is trading in individual stocks when you can have an influence in the market for individual companies. For example, buying steel when you know that the Trump administration is going to prop it up, that's a problem. Investing in a mutual fund that has thousands of different companies lumped in and you're not doing all this individual trading, there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. So I don't see why it's a problem that Hawley himself invests in mutual funds when that's totally fine according to the bill he wrote. And I don't see why it's pure political theater. You might say, well, he knows it's not going to come up for a vote. I don't think he knows that. I think he's really advocating for that. And I don't think that there is a 0% chance that Congress actually votes on either this piece of legislation or a similar one. So I'm going to disagree with you there, Nelson. I think that it's not pure political theater. I think it's a good thing, even if the bill doesn't go up for a vote, that someone is making this a topic of discussion and wrote a bill substantial enough to go before Congress and say, we should vote on this. Anyway, it's a great comment. Obviously, you're very cynical. There's nothing wrong with that. I think being a cynic is actually a rather smart move, so it's not a criticism to say that. But we have to try and be a little hopeful sometimes. And I think that it's a good thing for someone to do this, and I'm not going to pretend to read Hawley's mind and know that he was doing it cynically. So anyway, good comment. I disagree. Okay. Topic 1, the D.C. takeover. Dun, dun, dun. I wish I had I should have plugged that in on the machine over here. We could have hit that for some dramatic music. Could you imagine it? The clouds rumble and the lightning goes, the crash and the roll, and we get the dun, dun, dun. Because obviously, this is the end of the republic. I mean, it's been on the news all week that America's ending. Donald Trump has taken over D.C., the rest of the United States will follow. It's going to fall. It's the domino theory, but in the U.S. Once D.C. falls, the rest of the country comes along. Or that's absolute total nonsense, and this is absolutely nothing. I don't know if you can tell where I reside on that political spectrum, but we'll get into it. Maybe you'll figure it out by the end. For those of you who haven't been watching the news, what's going on? What am I talking about? What's happening out there? Donald Trump took over D.C. This is crazy. Well, yes and no. And here's what's happening. Donald Trump basically has said that crime in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., is out of control. And he has powers to basically come in and take over the police department and the other government functions, but in this case, the police department, because they're not doing their job And the city of Washington, D.C. technically still falls under the executive branch. So the president still technically is in charge of Washington, D.C. And let's talk about the argument real quick before we get further into good or bad. Is it true, first of all, what Donald Trump is saying, that crime in Washington, D.C. is out of control? You would have an almost impossible task ahead of you of arguing that's not true. If you're talking about crime in the rest of the country, and you look at averages across major cities, across the United States, so not major cities, just across the United States, for everyday crimes, you look at things like carjackings or murders or whatever the case may be. You pick a metric, robberies, these are good ones. D.C. outperforms every metric by a substantial margin. So, for example, one of the ones we just listed, carjackings. I think my numbers are going to be a little skewed here, but it's something like there are, per every 100,000 people, there's 20 carjackings, and in Washington, D.C., it's 60. It's 3 times the national average. The same thing is true with the murder rate. There are over 200 murders a year in Washington, D.C. And in the abstract, you think about that number, 200, and you say, wow, it doesn't sound that big. 200 murders is a lot of murders, okay? That's a gigantic number. So let's use my city because I'm very familiar with my city, St. Louis. St. Louis has a downtown population of 200,000 people, but it's not really the population of St. Louis. The working population of St. Louis is about 1 million people, okay? So there are about 1 million people in the metro area of St. Louis. When we have 200 murders a year, it's a high number. We've had upwards, I believe, of 240, and we've been as low as 150. But 200 murders a year is a substantial amount. People think St. Louis is dangerous. And the north part of St. Louis really is dangerous. The east side of St. Louis in the Illinois side is dangerous. And there are a lot of murders that take place there. But that number is about 200. That number alone is just in the city of Washington, D.C. And the city of Washington, D.C. has a population of 700,000 people. So the murders are, there's a lot of murders, there's a lot of carjackings, a lot of robberies. The robberies is another category with 3 times the national average. Robberies happen in Washington, D.C. So crime, by any metric you want to pick, is out of control in the nation's capital. So does Donald Trump have any foot to stand on when he says that crime is an issue in Washington, D.C.? Absolutely, 100%. There's a couple reasons for this we're going to get into, but a lot of it is there is a problem in Washington, D.C. specifically. I don't know how this reflects on the rest of the country. So, for example, we're talking about the numbers I just did, carjackings, murders, whatever the case may be. In Washington, D.C. specifically, I know that a gigantic percentage of the crime that's committed is committed by juveniles. I don't know if that's true in the rest of the country or how true that is in the rest of the country. I'm sure a percentage in every city is done, but a very large percentage is done by juveniles in Washington, D.C. So, for example, we have a couple of numbers here. 50% in 2024 of the robbery suspects and 60% of all carjacking suspects were minors. That seems like a ridiculous fact to me. I don't understand how that 60% of all the carjackings took place by someone younger than 18. That just seems ridiculous to me on its head. I doubt that that's true in the rest of the country. And part of this is because of a divide between how they prosecute people. The adults and the minors in Washington, D.C. get prosecuted in 2 different courts. And basically the juvenile court, it sounds like, is a joke. And no one gets seriously punished in juvenile court, which has allowed juvenile detention to basically, or juvenile suspects to basically go unpunished because they know they're not going to wind up in juvenile detention. So it's kind of a ridiculous thing. Donald Trump has stepped in. He has basically, I don't want to use the word usurped because that's not actually true because technically he was already in charge of Washington, D.C., but now he has appointed the DEA administrator, Terry Cole, to come in as the new police department's emergency police commissioner. So it's a big deal because everyone in Washington, D.C. is upset, and the rest of the country is saying, well, how can Donald Trump do this? It's a democratically elected city and blah, 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 blah. He has the right to do this. So immediately, the police commissioner and Pam Bondi, the acting attorney general for the United States, they rescinded some orders from the mayor and the police commissioner that dealt with illegal immigration, saying you couldn't check for immigrant status or you weren't going to comply with federal work order, federal law enforcement, all these different things. They got rid of this. The city is already suing him. It was announced, I believe, this morning, possibly late last night, that the city of Washington, D.C. is suing the federal government to try and stop this, but they basically have the right. And he has the authority. All you have to do is know a little bit of history and be able to read just a little tiny bit of legislative information. It really is not long. I don't understand where they think Donald Trump doesn't get this authority. So let's do a little history lesson here real quick, because Washington, D.C. is a very weird, unique situation in the country. But basically, when the Capitol was established, the land where Washington, D.C. sits, they had some land that was ceded by the state of Maryland and some land that was ceded by the state of Virginia. And in 1790, there were about 3,000 or so people who lived in Washington, D.C. So basically, it just was its own little thing because they didn't want the federal legislators. So let's say, for example, at the time you were a legislator from New York and you lived in New York, but maybe you also had to keep a house in D.C. because you went back and forth or you wanted to be there for certain proceedings, whatever the case may be. Or you had people who lived there who were appointed to various positions in the executive branch. There was a little bit of people who lived there. And what they didn't want is for the Capitol itself and the people who live there from other states, they didn't want them to be under the authority of a different state government. So, for example, they didn't want the state of Maryland or the state of Virginia to be in charge of the space because they wanted to try and balance this federal government in the state, and they wanted to have this unique thing for the federal government. So it was kind of this weird situation where the people who lived there actually tended to vote in either Maryland or Virginia. They were the people who weren't citizens from other states. They actually voted in Maryland or Virginia. Then it became this thing where more and more people lived in Washington, D.C. The bureaucracy grew. The executive has grown. There are now, like I said, 700,000 people who live in the city of Washington, D.C. Little less than a million, but 700,000 people is actually, I think it's bigger than the population-wise. It actually is bigger than the lowest two states. So it's bigger than Wyoming in terms of population, and it's bigger than Vermont in terms of population. It might be bigger than three, but at least those two, it's bigger than. So it's become this different thing. And it used to be that the city of Washington, D.C. basically was run by the president. The president he'd appoint the mayor, he'd appoint the city council, he'd do all these things, and it basically ran like that for a long time. Actually, it really changed in the 70s. So when in what year is this? 1973. In 1973, they passed this act called the Home Rule Act, which allowed the citizens of Washington, D.C. to vote for their own local government. So they voted for mayor, they voted for city council, and they got to have this little independence from the federal government. It's been going on since the 70s. They had a little bit before that, but it really changed in the 70s where they started voting for their own thing, and the president no longer appoints everyone. The citizens get to elect people. So this only happened in the 70s. And the reason it happened is because the population of Washington, D.C. grew. When the founders designed the system, again, they didn't want people to the federal government to be beholden to a state. That's what they didn't want. They thought that was the opposite, that the states should be able to run land owned by the federal government. It didn't make sense. It still doesn't really make sense. So here's the problem. The problem is, and as the argument goes, the problem is that D.C. has grown, and it has grown substantially. As I said, the population of Washington, D.C. is bigger than the bottom two states in terms of population size, where Wyoming has a population 500,000, somewhere around there, and Vermont is 700,000, but I think it's less than D.C., somewhere around this. But it's bigger than those two things, maybe possibly the bottom three. But this is a problem because there's an argument to be made that this sort of, the people in D.C., they pay taxes, they do all this stuff, and it is true that there is an argument to be made about taxation and representation and how can you vote for this stuff if you don't have a say in things like Congress, and they get a ceremonial vote, but they don't really count. So it's this interesting thing, but it's still the idea that right now, what the Democrats are proposing and what is a separate issue from this issue of Donald Trump taking over, the Democrats are proposing that D.C. become a state. This is just a ridiculous notion. D.C. is not a state. D.C. is a city. It shouldn't be treated like a state. It's ridiculous to think that. You think, okay, for example, We've been talking about population size. You say, well, it's bigger than Wyoming. Wyoming's a state. Look at a map. Tell me why Wyoming can't be a state. Do you see how big Wyoming is? I understand that 500,000 people live there, but do you see the land mass that Wyoming maybe, yes, maybe Wyoming could be cut up and divided among other states because the population is small, but it's a gigantic piece of territory. You can't say that D.C. is the same. D.C. is a city that doesn't exist outside of the capital. It really exist. It wouldn't exist without the capital. So the solution really should be that some of the residential land that makes up Washington, D.C. should be ceded back to states, or you should be allowed to vote if, for example, Washington, D.C. is your home. So you are a citizen. Let's use the New York example. Again, you're a legislator from New York. So your primary residence is where you live in New York, but you own a house in Washington, D.C. Okay, that should be fine. You don't need to vote in Washington, D.C. You live in New York. But for people who only live in Washington, D.C., you only own a house, this is your main residence, your primary place of residence, you should be able to pick if you want to live under the government of Maryland or Virginia, or they can divide it a certain way, and this is actually the state. You vote in that state election. You vote in that state election. You vote for these people because actually those are the tax policies that are going to affect you. This is it. Washington, D.C. doesn't get to be its own thing. If you're wanting representation, that's the solution. The solution isn't to make it a state. That's ridiculous. We're getting off topic here, by the way. But it is a ridiculous notion that Washington, D.C. should be a state. It's crazy. I think that, yes, you have an argument. No taxation without representation is a big deal. It's why we fought a war against Britain. So the solution, though, is that those people get to vote in a state that's nearby, not to make a city a state. Cities aren't states, okay? I don't know. This doesn't seem complicated to me to say that cities are not states. It's a different thing. I don't care that you have 700,000 people who live there. You're not Wyoming. You're not Vermont. You're not this place and this history and this culture and this people, and you're not that thing. You're different. You exist only because the federal government is there. And if you only live in Washington, D.C., yes, maybe you should be able to vote in a state election for Maryland or Virginia. But you don't get to be a state. You don't. The fact that the idea we would give Washington, D.C. 2 senators is insane. The people who want that, they're not doing it for noble reasons. They're doing it because Washington, D.C. historically is a very Democratic-leaning city. And because of that, you'd have 2 Democratic senators. That's why. It is a cynical ploy. It's not anything worthwhile, and we shouldn't even entertain it. But also, it's a real fear of mine, because it would do is that trying to gain power. It's not for any principled reason, not for any good reason. It's just a power move. So Donald Trump has come in. Donald Trump has asserted his authority in a constitutionally protected way that says Congress still has to approve laws passed in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., the government there is a figurehead. They do not actually have power because the law still gets approved by Congress. Donald Trump still has the authority to come in there for emergencies and declare himself in charge. Crime in major cities is a gigantic issue. It is a huge problem, and it is actually the problem that Republicans should run on more than anything else, because throughout the country, in Democratic-run cities, crime is the biggest issue in the world, and we want to pretend that we have an over-incarceration problem or that the policing in this country is bad. We have great policing in the United States. We don't have an over-incarceration problem. We have an under-incarceration problem. And this is another thing about Washington, D.C. They've been doing, you see this in a lot of major cities. So one thing that the people in Washington, D.C. who are in charge, the police commissioner and the higher-ups will say, is that crime in Washington, D.C. is actually ticked downward. This is not true. This is a lie. And they lie with numbers, and they do it in a cynical way to trick you and show you a graph that makes it seem as though crime is getting better. What has happened, and you see this in Democratic cities across the country, is that the mayor and the police commissioners will get together and they'll cook the books. They will fake data to make crime look better. Meanwhile, on the streets, you know what reality is because you can look around and see. But what they'll do is they'll say things like this. They will reclassify felonies as misdemeanors. They'll charge people, instead of charging them as felonies, they'll charge them as misdemeanors. And they'll reclassify misdemeanors as nothing. And they'll just let them go. And therefore, there's less crime because we've just made crime non-existent because we've just reclassified what crime is. It doesn't make the crime go away. So when you do things like San Francisco, for example, they'll do things and they'll say, well, shoplifting is no longer a crime. We're not going to prosecute it. Did the crime go away in San Francisco? Has anyone been there? Can you tell me how's the crime in San Francisco? How is the shoplifting problem? How is the smashing of the windows on the cars and theft and carjackings, and how is all this stuff going? Because when the old district attorney was in there, it was terrible because they reclassified crime as not crime. They say, it's not really crime. So the numbers go down. You say, hey, look, we actually had less felonies. We had less misdemeanors this year than last year. Isn't that great? Crime is on the downward swing. And you go, well, that's actually not true because all you've done is reclassify felonies to misdemeanors. It doesn't make mean there's less felonies. It just means you're not prosecuting them as felonies. And that's what they did in Washington, D.C. That's what they've been doing in Washington, D.C. And it's ridiculous. We heard this week a couple testimonies of different police officers who say basically any crime that you go to, there's a captain or a lieutenant who shows up, who tells you how to write a report, and that report will almost inevitably reclassify whatever you're doing, and they will charge it with the lowest possible offense that there is. So let's say, I'm just making up an example here. Let's say, for example, that you go out and you steal a car, and you then crash that car, and then you flee, and then you assault a police officer when they're trying to arrest you. They'll say, okay, charge him with reckless endangerment. Not the carjacking, not the theft, not the assault of the officer, not the felonies. Charge him with reckless endangerment, and then we'll classify it as a misdemeanor. That's what they're saying has been happening in Washington, D.C. with crime reporting, and it still is out of control. So they still can't deny that the crime in Washington, D.C. is crazy, even when they're trying to cook the books. So it's a real problem. Is it the end of the republic? No. Donald Trump has the constitutional authority to do exactly what he's doing, activating the National Guard, supplying federal troops to Washington, D.C. to clean up the crime. We should be doing this in every major city. When I've lived downtown in St. Louis for a long time, St. Louis has a bad rap because it's a very strange thing. As I was saying, our downtown population in St. Louis is about 200,000 people. But 1 million people are downtown every single day because we have a working population, I believe, of 1.1 million people in downtown St. Louis, but a residential population of 200,000 people. So when you look at the crime data for St. Louis, it's often skewed because of these numbers, because we actually have a lot more people here than it seems like we do. So what they'll do is, let's say, just make up something, for example. Imagine there's a murder, and you have 1 million people, and we say, well, there's one murder per 1 million people. And they go, okay. And then we say, well, that's not how it is in St. Louis. There's one murder for 200,000 people. And so it makes our numbers look 3 times higher, 5 times higher, even though they're about even with some others. I'm not saying St. Louis is the safest place in the world. It's certainly not. But we often make the list for number 1 most dangerous city. I've lived downtown for a long time. Downtown St. Louis is fine. Downtown St. Louis got worse during COVID, as did many of our major cities in America. It got worse during COVID. Crime got worse during COVID. And the policing got worse in the wake of the death of St. George Floyd. It got worse. And because of that, it never has recovered. It really never came back. It feels like the last couple of years it started to. Maybe this last year in particular, downtown where I live has felt like maybe it's coming back. But it never did. And it did that in a lot of major cities. And this coincided with the push for different kinds of restorative justice and all these different things where we were pushing very, very left-leaning progressive DAs who came in here and just decriminalized crime. So in St. Louis, we had a particularly bad one named Kim Gardner. I've done podcasts on her in the past, who eventually she got ousted. But it's these kind of people, or that Chesa Boudin that I was talking about in San Francisco, these kind of prosecutors are actually the bigger issue. More than anything else, they affect how the cities work, because if you run this revolving door with your crime, which they're doing in D.C., which they did in St. Louis, they did in San Francisco, they do in all these cities with all these progressive DAs, what you find is it's not going to solve crime. It turns out that crime is the problem. It's not the police. It's not the justice system. It's not anything else. It's the criminals. The criminals are the problem. And what happens is the way you fix crime, it's actually not complicated. We pretend it is. It's not complicated. If you commit a crime, you go to jail, period. Full stop, end of story. You don't do anything else. There's no plea deals. There's no anything that doesn't involve jail time. You go to jail. Jail actually solves problems. It really does. And I know people say we have an over-incarceration problem. No, we don't. We have an under-incarceration problem. We do not send people to jail for crimes. And when you commit a crime, you need to go there. That's the only solution. The only thing that works for reducing crime. Because it turns out, and I've told this to many people, the guys who commit the serious crimes, the guys who are out there doing the carjackings and committing the murders and the strong arm robberies and all these things, those are the same group of people who commit the low-level crimes of vandalism and all, whatever the nonsense is. They're the same group. It's not two separate groups. It's not as though there's criminals who do small crime, criminals who do big crime. There's criminals who do crime. And what you can find is with a lot of these, for example, what was the name of the guy? Oh, my gosh, I'm going to forget his name. The Daniel Perry, the Jordan Neely, the subway lunatic who Daniel Perry choked and wound up dying. That guy right there is a great example. He died. It created this whole big controversy, all this outrage, whatever. However you feel about it, I think Daniel Perry's a hero. Those kind of guys deserve praise. Jordan Neely's a terrible person. Jordan Neely had committed so many crimes in the city of New York. He punched a pregnant lady. He pushed some guy on the tracks. He did whatever. Left 1, 2, 3. He committed all these crimes. He got arrested. He would get out. He got arrested. He would get out. He just released. No cash bail. Just, all right, you're back out. Maybe you'll have a court date sometime in the future. See you later. He did this multiple times. Send that guy to jail. Those other crimes don't get committed. He punched a pregnant lady in the face. He hit an old man. He did all this stuff. Send him to jail. And those other crimes don't get done because it turns out that the criminal is the guy who's doing the crime. And he did this crime, and then he goes and does that crime, and then he does that next crime. He doesn't stop at the one crime. And we don't do that in society enough. We're not policing low level. And that's what this thing in New York, this thing in Washington, D.C. is about. It's about policing crime and saying we are going to hold criminals accountable because we've stopped doing that as a country. And because of that, crime has gotten worse. And we're going to use this next topic as another example. So topic 2, safe injection sites. Now, if you don't know what a safe injection site is, I know we slightly alluded to it just a minute ago. But basically, these things have popped up in the last 5 years. And they're, for lack of a better word, we'll just call it a clinic. It's a clinic you can go to, and if you're a drug user, they give you free needles. They give you a place to do drugs. You can do drugs on the premises. And the idea of it is that it prevents the spread of communicable diseases. So you don't have people using dirty needles. You don't have people getting sick because of that. You reducing your risk of HIV, AIDS, hepatitis, all these really serious illnesses that come along with drug use. You're reducing that. And that's a good thing. And I'm not going to argue that that's not a good thing. But do they do anything positive for the people who are using drugs? Are they actually helping anyone using drugs? It's basically based on a European model. And what we've found is that around the world, different groups, different populations of different people behave differently. It turns out we're not all interchangeable cogs. There's a reason why every 4 years we have to read stories in the World Cup about how the Japanese spectators clean all the stands. They're very respectful. They're very awesome. It's a great part of their culture that they feel the need to clean up for themselves. You ever been to a baseball game in the United States, and then as people are leaving, you look down the aisles and you just see all the slop and filth and disgusting things that people leave behind? I always clean up after myself at a baseball game. It's not somebody's job to walk through the stands and clean up your mess. Just throw your stuff in the garbage. The Japanese people do that, and we have to read about it every 4 years because it turns out they're different. There's a different culture, and they're more respectful, and they do these things than the average American person at a baseball game. So when you say, we're going to take this European model that they did in some of the Scandinavian countries, and we're going to it actually lowered the use of hardcore drugs in Scandinavia when we open these centers because it allows people a safe way to do drugs and eventually we can get them off the drugs and blah, blah, blah. I haven't seen any evidence that this works the way it's supposed to work. It is not reducing drug use in the United States because it turns out that the United States is different than Scandinavia. Big shock. We're different than the Europeans. And I don't see a reason why we should keep funding these kind of sites. And I don't think this one's actually, I'm not 100% sure, actually, as I say this, whether or not this is taxpayer funded or if it's a non-for-profit that is funded privately, I'm not 100% sure. But all I know is that they opened these sites in New York City last year, and they've had 6,000 people utilize this one site to come in and use illicit drugs, and it was utilized 38,000 times last year alone. So what people are saying, and the reason why this is making news, is that the area around the center has become worse. You're seeing sex, you're seeing needles, you've seen an uptick in crime, and you actually heard reports. There are multiple reports from multiple people who have been in the paper talking about this, where basically they're saying these people are coming out and they'll come out of the center, they'll go in the middle, they'll go on the sidewalk, they'll lay a blanket down, and then they'll start having sex right in the middle of the street, right in the middle of the day. No one cares. Nothing you can do. You're basically getting a free porno show every time you leave your house, and they're saying it's a real problem, and you've seen this reported multiple times. Same with needles. They're finding needles, even though you're not supposed to leave with needles. They're finding needles on the street, and the crime around there, the petty crime, things like breaking into the cars and all that stuff has increased in the area around this. What do you expect? This is a pattern. Normalizing bad behavior doesn't make the behavior fine. Just because you decriminalize something, it doesn't make it good. It doesn't make it moral. And we found that that's not the case. We think that, it's bad to have laws against marijuana because X, Y, and Z. It's historically it's been used racially or we legalized alcohol. Why can't we talk about marijuana use? Or why don't we decriminalize hard drugs like heroin? Because it's actually a personal addiction issue and it's not a crime issue. We've tried this. Decriminalizing things doesn't actually make the behavior better, and it doesn't actually decrease the behavior. The war on drugs has been a failure for a number of reasons, but it's not for lack of intent. It's not because it wasn't for a good reason. Drug use should not be normalized. We've normalized it to a crazy extent in America because we've normalized prescription drugs and we've normalized alcohol. We've done all these things that I think are bad. Okay. Maybe you know, maybe you don't know. Myself, I'm a teetotaler, okay? I don't drink alcohol. I don't smoke, never smoked a cigarette, never done drugs. I don't like these things. I do not like them at all. I'm not the kind of person who wants to tell another person they're not allowed to do something. That is not my inclination in life ever. I do not care what other people do. However, there are behaviors that suggest that certain things cannot be tolerated. Hard drugs are different. I don't like pot. I don't like marijuana. I don't like it. I've known people, you can function in life using marijuana. You see people do it every day. The same is not true of heroin. The same is not true of cocaine. The same is not true of prescription drugs that are abused. And if you look at it with excess of anything is bad. I take too much vitamin C, it will kill me. Okay? So excess of anything is bad. Alcohol in moderation. I've seen people who can drink in moderation, who can go out and have a beer and be fine. I think way too many people think that moderation, that their version of moderation to me is excessive. Same with pot. If someone wants to go and take their gummy and go to a concert, okay, whatever, that's fine. Doesn't really bother me as long as they're not driving, as long as they're not doing these things. But like, I see that. It's fine. You can't moderately use heroin. I'm sorry, you just can't. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work with opiates. It doesn't work with these hard drugs that are life-consuming because there are certain things that you do. It's like an alcoholic. To an alcoholic, one drink is the end of life because one drink leads to another because there's no control. There is no such thing as one drink with heroin. It doesn't work that way. It will ruin your life and you don't go back. You can't casually do it is what I'm saying. So these addiction centers, these safe, clean injection site places, they're not helping these people. We think that they are. We think that it's good because we're going to stop them from getting diseases. What we need to do is force them into treatment programs. And I know that sounds bad, but you really can. There's not a good solution. Leaving someone on the street in the throes of addiction to a substance like heroin is not helpful for them. Putting them in jail probably is not going to help. But if we had some sort of a jail-like system for rehabilitation, or maybe you put them in jail and you force them to go to rehab, whatever the case may be, that is more helpful than this bullshit. I will tell you that. This is not helping these people. It's not helping them get better. It's not helping them. You can't be free from a substance that has altered your chemistry to a point that you can't live without it. And heroin, things like that, opiates, they will do that to you. They will rewire your neurochemistry, and that's why you start jonesing. You see that when it rewires your brain like that. I have nothing but sympathy for addicts. I know there are people out there, it's easy to hate on them. You say it's a personal choice. You say, oh, well, they did it to themselves. I don't believe that. There's an incredibly strong genetic component to addiction. Not everyone who's an addict ever really had that chance that you think of, because you can casually drink or you can casually use drugs like pot or smoke or whatever the case may be. And then you look at a guy who can't and you look down on him. But you don't realize there actually is a genetic component to this. This is one that it's not your fault if you're an addict. Part of it is. I'm not taking away personal responsibility from everyone. But I'm saying part of that is a genetic component that you didn't choose. But what you can choose is whether or not you do it at all. And that is true, and that is a hard thing for people to understand. But this kind of stuff doesn't help. We're not Europeans. We're not going to go to Norway and casually use heroin in some sauna and then be like, okay, well, I guess it's time to quit. No, Americans just double down, and it makes everything worse. It all goes back to the crime that we were talking about earlier. When in the 90s, we figured crime out. They figured it out in New York City, where these open injection sites are a problem. They figured out crime in the 90s. It's never been easier to figure out than it was with the data that says, hey, New York City was kind of seedy and scummy in the 70s and 80s. And in the 90s, they cleaned it up. And how did they do it? They cleaned it up by policing low-level crime. We figured it out. That's the answer. The answer is, and by the way, that's the opposite of what we do today. We don't police low-level crime, and therefore all the crime is worse. When you police low-level crime, that stuff I'm talking about, vandalism, shoplifting, drug use, all these things, when you police these low-level crimes, the rest of the crime gets better, because the same people who commit the low-level crimes commit the high-level crimes. It's a pattern. You typically don't start one day at strong-armed robbery. You typically don't start there. You don't start at murder. You start doing other things when you're younger. You start doing vandalism. You start doing carjackings. You start doing these other crimes first, and they lead to the big things. When you police the low things, the big things actually get better because you're in jail before you get to the big thing. We're not policing, it's not pre-crime. We're not trying to police the future. But that's an actual crime you committed at the low-end level. And if you police it there, if you police drug use, if you police places, instead of allowing people to go and use their opiates in the drug site, if you start arresting people for illegal substances, if you start arresting people for vagrancy and vandalism and all these things, the rest of the crime gets better. Donald Trump, Republicans seem to understand this, because the Republicans in New York in the 90s fixed crime. Broken windows theory works. People don't like it. They think it's too aggressive. They think it has some racial component, because maybe it turns out that a disproportionate number of black people wind up incarcerated. I don't care. It doesn't matter, because whoever's doing the crime should be incarcerated. Show me one person in jail who is there wrongly, and I will fight tooth and nail to get that person out, because we want justice. Justice means policing crime. Any person who's unjustly incarcerated, show me that person, and let's talk about it. Let's get them out. But when they say that, they just point to the numbers and say, well, too many black people are in jail. And I say, well, which one didn't commit a crime? Okay, I don't care who goes to jail. Anyone who commits a crime, I don't care if it turned out that no black people ever committed crime, and so therefore they were 0% in the jail. Great, that's fine. If it's nothing but a bunch of white people who look exactly like me in jail, I don't care, because guess what? It's easy for me not to commit crime. I do it basically every day. And, I'm in the city. We don't always. Sometimes we treat red lights like stop signs. Okay, I'll admit it. I do this. I'm one of those guys. Sometimes I stop and I go, all right, no cars. 6 o'clock in the morning, got places to be. I got to go to work. I'm running it. Okay, but so that's me. That's my low-level crime. That's about as bad as it gets these days. And if someone wanted to start writing tickets in the city, if they want to take time from not solving the 200 murders that happened in St. Louis and all the robberies, and they want to start policing traffic crime, hey, I'll change my tune. But until then, whatever. My point is, low-level crime is what you need to fix to have a functioning society. Take over D.C., Donald Trump. Fix the crime problem. Show us what to do. Show the country how it's done. And I beg people in the big cities, please stop voting for incredibly left-leaning politicians. Realize the justice system. There's a book up here on my shelf called The New Jim Crow, written by Michelle Alexander. It basically talks about all this stuff, and it talks about it in the exact wrong way. Basically using backwards logic of showing numbers. Here's how black people are disproportionately represented in this category or this category, and then working backwards from there with the assumption that it's racist. We can't do that. We can't play this game anymore. I don't care. Black people are affected by crime more than white people, more than their white counterparts, because crime happens in low-income areas. We all acknowledge that, unfortunately, the black people are disproportionately in that low-income bracket. And so when I look at North St. Louis, it's black people who are getting killed. Typically, it's by other black people, and that's a problem. So if black people go to jail, you know what we're actually doing? We're saving the lives of the other people in their community, because that's who is affected by crime. Same thing is true with basically everyone. White people kill white people, black people kill black people, except for Asians. Asians are the only group, by the way. Black people kill Asians more than Asians kill Asians. That's just a fact. I don't know. Don't shoot the messenger. But this crime thing, I want to police it for everyone. I don't want to police it to protect me or the white people or Asian people or whatever it is. I want to protect everyone equally. And we cannot pretend that the police are the problem or that the system is the problem or that the justice system is the problem. No, the problem is crime. The problem is crime. Put the criminals in jail. Donald Trump gets it. Republicans should be running on this. It's the only way forward. It's the only way we're going to get better as a country. Like, we could have a country that's great and beautiful and fun and free and cities that are nice. And we don't have that right now. We don't have cities that are downtown you go to and you say, wow, this is great. We have a lot of places. I've been to a lot of cities in the United States. There's some nice places in many cities, and then there are just some terrible places. And there shouldn't be. There's no need to be. Put those people in jail. Put the people who make the terrible places in the city bad, put them in jail. And the city gets nice, and it's nice, and everyone likes it, and everyone prospers, because it turns out that the criminal element is actually a small percentage of the American population. It's not a big percentage. It's a small percentage. So you take the criminals, you put them off the street, and everyone else gets to live happy and healthy lives, and that's better for everyone. Anyway, okay, I'm talking too much. I'm ranting too much. I kind of was just, this topic is really wound up being about crime more than D.C., more than about the safe injection sites. This is a big deal for me. This is like number one right now in my issues, is talking about crime and why and how easy it is to fix. It's so easy. It's not difficult. It's not a hard fix. The fix is when you catch criminals, they stay in jail. That's it. That's the only solution. Stop letting criminals run wild. And we catch them. Because that's the other thing, too, that we didn't talk about real quick. We catch criminals. The police actually catch people a lot of the time. Not all the time. I get it. There's a lot of crimes that are not going to be solved. I get that. But they catch them. And the problem is for the police is when you catch them and you take them to jail and then some prosecuting attorney says, let them right out. No cash bail. Oh, we're not going to hold them till trial because X, Y, or Z, and they're right back out on the street. That's why you get these people. I think there was something like 200 people or 300 people in New York who were responsible for 25,000 shoplifting incidents, and they kept getting arrested. Someone was arrested 200 times in a year because they realized, you're not prosecuting this. So they just kept getting arrested and kept getting out and going back and shoplifting and getting out. And so you're talking about 200 people, 600 people, whatever it is. I can't remember the number. But it was a small number of people when you're talking about 1 million people in New York or however many it is. And you're saying these couple hundred people were responsible for thousands and thousands of crimes and never put them in jail. So anyway, that's the solution. We're going to leave it there for the week. As always, people, questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the comments below. I will, if your comment is fun or funny or I want to make fun of you, leave it down there and we'll talk about it on next week's episode. But I like when people disagree with me. Obviously, Nelson from earlier, he disagreed with me, and that's fine. You're allowed to disagree with me. I like it. Don't matter. I'll tell you what I think. Follow it either in the comments or on the video next week. And as for that, we're going to leave it there. I will catch you guys next Friday. Until then, have a great week.